I'm delighted to welcome Tim Harford to this call. He's an economist, he's a writer, he's a broadcaster. He's the author of The Undercover Economist. He's spoken at TED conferences. He's been on the stand-up comedy circuit as well. He's spoken from London to Sydney. He's spoken at the Sydney Opera House, and now he's here with us.
So I think there are two basic reasons why this sort of thing happens. And the first is psychological. So I discussed this whole thing with the record producer and ambient composer, Brian Eno, who is an absolutely astonishing thinker as well as musician. And he's worked with Devo and Twyla Tharp and U2 and Coldplay and created his own amazing ambient music, and most famously worked with David Bowie on the so-called Berlin trilogy of albums, Heroes, Lodger, and Low. And so he's thought a lot about this, what a creative process looks like. And he said to me, look, the enemy of creative work is boredom. And the friend of creative work is attention. And the point that Brian makes is, boredom is the death of creativity. Well, you would think, well, that's no problem because I don't like to be bored. I like to be interested. I like to be stimulated. So that's fine for my creativity. But the truth is, we actually do like to be bored. Or I think more precisely, we like to feel comfortable. We have certain kinds of routines. We go to certain places, we do certain things, we get into a sort of groove. And that groove is comfortable, familiar places, familiar tools, familiar people, but it's also boring. And the excitement of creativity, the thing that focuses our attention, and that sounds great, but actually often what grabs our attention is something that's actually quite distressing or worrying or makes us feel uncomfortable. And the cliche of you step out in front of the bus and your life flashes before you, that's attention. Now, with all of this, of course, comes the realization that this doesn't come naturally. Disruption is not actually fun. We do not seek out disruption. We do not generally enjoy working for bosses or colleagues who disrupt us. And I think I probably don't need to give you studies proving this. I think just reflecting on your own experience will tell us that this is true for most of us. But there is one really interesting little study that I think speaks to the problem very precisely. This study was conducted by 3 psychologists led by Catherine Phillips of Northwestern University in the United States. And what they did was to gather together small groups and ask them to solve a kind of murder mystery problem. So it turns out these are quite hard problems. So if you give an individual this dossier and 20 minutes, the chance that they'll solve the problem is a bit less than 50%. But if you ask 4 friends to work together on the problem for 20 minutes, they'll do better. Their problem solving rate goes up just above 50%, which is still not great. But the way that Catherine Phillips and her colleagues conducted this study was a randomized trial, where half of the teams of 4 were friends, and the other half were a group of 3 friends plus a stranger. And you can probably guess, given what I've been talking about for the last 20 or 25 minutes, the teams with the stranger did better. But what I found really interesting was how people felt about this experiment. So when Catherine Phillips interviewed them, the people who'd worked with their friends had a nice time. They also thought they'd solved the problem. Whereas the people who were working with a stranger didn't have a good time, but also didn't feel confident that they'd found the right solution. And remember, these teams are doing much better. So that's really extraordinary. I think it speaks to the challenge that we have here. Because you've got a situation where systematically you've shaken the teams up in a way that helps them solve the problem. And first, they don't like it. And second, they don't even know that it's helping. So this is a big challenge, I think. And I went back to Brian Eno for advice about this, because one of the things that Brian Eno did when he was working on David Bowie's albums was to deliberately shake things up, to deliberately disrupt what the musicians were doing. So he quite famously, if you're a music nerd, he produced this box of cards called the Oblique Strategies with Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. If they're mirror writing, I apologize. So I've got my copy here. When I met Brian, he's like, "Would you like one?" I was like, "Yes, please, so very much. I would really like one." Such a fanboy. So this is my favorite one. I don't know if you're able to see that, but I can read it for you. It says change instrument roles. So this is an instruction to move to a different instrument. This is idiotic. You've got the best guitarist in the world, Carlos Alomar, and you've got the best drummer in the world, but now Carlos Alomar is playing the drums, and your drummer, Phil Collins was the drummer on some of this stuff. Phil Collins is on the guitar, Carlos Alomar is on the drums. I mean, this does not help, okay? Or does it? Because Carlos Alomar was on the drums during the making of Heroes, which is one of the most iconic tracks of the 20th century. It's unbelievable. Nobody knew what was going on when that thing was being made. So you've got Brian Eno drawing cards from this box and making people do these stupid things and producing the most amazing results. What I find fascinating about it is that the musicians hated them. They hated them at the time. They thought the whole thing was stupid. They thought the music sounded rubbish. They really took a dislike to Brian Eno. And it was only 30 years later that the musicians would start to go, "Oh, actually, it was pretty good what was happening there." So Carlos Alomar, he gave an interview to documentary makers. He said, "Those cards are stupid cards. They took me to a different place. And to be honest, I didn't like the place. But then when I got back, I was fresh." So maybe there is something to them. The other thing that strikes me about these cards is they weren't originally cards. They were originally just a checklist on the wall of things to try. And Brian Eno realized the checklist doesn't work because it's just too tidy. You just pick whatever you kind of fancied doing anyway. And to actually have their full effect, the cards need to be disruptive. They need to be random. They need to confront you with something that you don't want to do.